right? And I don't know that this is a good investment for you.
That's astounding. I know a couple of lawyers that you should definitely talk to. That is illegal under the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The idea that a president of a higher education institution would tell you what job you are and are not allowed to take, or what degree you can or cannot enroll for, is the total derogation of every principle on which this country was founded.
Amen.
And the idea that that would in any way be acceptable under the existing economic paradigm should cause my entire profession to go hang their heads in shame, never to be seen in public again until they issue a blanket apology to the entire United States population signed by every single PhD economist who's currently been adjudicated as such by any PhD granting institution in this country.
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we've got a topical guest, economist Marshall Steinbaum, who is, if I'm not mistaken, currently works at the Roosevelt Institute, but will shortly be moving to the University of Utah to be a proper professor. Is that correct, Marshall?
Yes, although I have absolutely no intention of being proper.
Well done, well done. Bravo and congratulations and welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, all you future econ students out there, if you're looking to do a PhD or master's or whatever, I don't know how economics works, but definitely look at the University of Utah there. You get the straight dope. None of that neoliberal bullshit.
Yeah, no, we definitely don't do that.
And even though you have your PhD from the University of Chicago, I doubt you'll be the Chicago School of Economics when you teach.
Well, I mean, I don't like to pretend to be anything other than what I am. It's kind of helpful to be able to, shoot from behind the battlements, that sort of thing.
Well, hopefully your students in the future will not have to go too deep into debt to learn from your wise lectures and seminars.
I hope so, too, thanks to the great Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Indeed.
Yeah. I guess this brings up our first topic of conversation here, the Warren plan, in which she wants to set up free college, but she also wants to forgive a lot of student debt on a sort of sliding scale. Like it's somewhat means tested depending on your income. I think you get $50,000, but the sort of amount diminishes as you make more and more money. So I guess, first thing, Marshall, what are your thoughts on the plan? You think it's any good?
Yes. Yeah, I think it is definitely a strong step in the right direction. There's a lot of reluctance in the kind of student debt, higher education policy establishment about cancellation of student debt. My interpretation of that reluctance is basically that people don't want to admit how much of a policy failure student debt has been, or I should say the expansion of student debt, the enormous explosion of the amount of student debt outstanding in the population, way beyond what the program was envisioned to have been when it was first created. People have for a long time thought of student debt as good debt, that it is kind of inherently able to be paid back because by taking it on, you acquire the skills that allow you to earn more in the labor market and thus to have the wherewithal to pay back whatever amount of student debt you acquire. That's been the basis of federal student loan policy for a long time. In my estimation, I consider it to be the largest federal labor market policy of recent decades, and it's premised on a kind of understanding of how the labor market works, of how the economy works, that human capital, that skills acquired in higher education translate directly into earnings in the labor market, and this makes it sensible for the population to layer on more and more student debt, more and more higher education credentials, because it's kind of has this magical ability to pay itself back. And I think this Warren proposal recognizes the long-term failure that policy has been.
Yeah. Okay. I want to dig into that aspect of it a little bit later, but I guess there's sort of like there's two components here, right? So you want to set up free 2-year and 4-year public colleges, across the country, so that people can attend at least tuition free. There'll still be some room and board stuff, presumably. And then there's a debt cancellation effect, and maybe if you could go into like a little bit more detail on the specific case for canceling that debt, at least like a decent portion of it. And she wants to pay for it, quote unquote, with a kind of a big old wealth tax
is it part of the 2% wealth tax on people making 50 million or more, I believe?
Yeah, tax on the rich. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but anyway, so you're looking to pay for it, but you could also, I guess I could imagine as a system where you just cancel the debt and you just force all the lenders to eat that hit. Like what do you think? What's the case for doing it one way instead of the other? Would you say? And like, what are the sort of broader consequences of forgiving that debt? And like, why should we do it, in your opinion?
Sure. So a lot of issues kind of being swept in here. The federal government is the creditor for the vast majority of student debt that's currently outstanding. So there aren't a vast set of lenders out there for most people's student debt. I think it's more than 90% the creditor is the federal government at this point. And, it's not logistically any difficulty for the federal government to basically forgive the debt or to cancel the debt. They're the creditor. They can legally do that. There's the sort of fiscal policy question of, okay, well, that's a large stream of money that's coming into the federal treasury or expected to come into the federal treasury. To what extent do we need to offset that expected stream of income from the source of people paying back their student loans with some other source of revenue that kind of pertains to the progressive taxation proposals that you mentioned earlier. And I'm happy to talk about progressive taxation. I think Senator Warren has also proposed some really good ideas on that front. But I also think it sort of serves to separate those issues, at least in respect to the higher education / student debt policy proposal that's on the table today, because I think it really stands on its own. And I think that it deserves attention unto itself. And the progressive taxation side of the coin is kind of its own separate policy area. I mean, linked by a larger philosophy of how the economy works and how it should work, but I don't want to kind of bog us down in discussing a student loan cancellation policy or a free college policy with the sort of, well, how are you going to pay for it kind of question that I think has gotten left policy way too far in the weeds in the past.
Well, Marshall, would you say that the study that Stephanie Kelton kind of promoted about debt cancellation being stimulative and on balance helping the economy is worth talking about? Or is that also...
As a co-author of that study, I would have to say yes, dispassionately. The basic the macroeconomic premise behind that work is that currently households in the form, student debtors that are households carry a lot of debt that's weighing them down. And if the burden of that debt were transferred from relatively encumbered households to relatively unencumbered government in terms of who's on the hook to pay down that debt, that would be macroeconomically stimulative in a Keynesian sense, that the federal government has the ability to carry debt much more so than households. That is to say, when you relieve the households of that burden of debt, the result is that they spend more money, and this has a Keynesian multiplier effect. So yes, I mean, as we released that study, a year and a half ago or so, and I stand by the conclusion of it that that transferring the burden of student debt from households to the government would stimulate the macroeconomy. I think that's kind of not really the terrain on which the battle over higher education and student debt policy will be fought, as important as it is to say that, quote unquote, we can afford to cancel all the student debt. That's not really what the policy wonks or the policy debate over whether we should actually do this will be fought about. It will be fought over to what degree is this an unfair policy? Is this egalitarian in a horizontal sense? That is, the people who didn't have to take on debt to go to college, won't necessarily get anything out of the cancellation of people's outstanding balances. Is that fair versus, the people who have to take on debt to go to college are a very different subset of the population than the people who don't. So there's all these sort of important dimensions of the debate over student debt and higher education policy that I think deserve to be gone into, in part because a lot of the conventional wisdom, especially that gets bandied about in the national economic policy press about student debt and its impact on the economy, is just totally false.
Right. Yeah, there's this notion that like the people who go to college are just like they're coextensive with the kind of people who go to Harvard. You know, they're wealthy white people, you know, like the very upper crust of the, Black or Latino populations. And so like, it's really not that progressive of policy. And I think, you know, in like a total distribution sense, that may be like broadly speaking true. But if you look at the distribution of debt, it really extends very far down into the middle class and the working class. And the people who have the debt problem the worst, as you write in this Boston Review article, you know, and as Tressie McMillan Cottom has written in her book Lower Ed, it's the sort of black middle class that gets sucked into these for-profit schools, you know, and so like. It's not as simple as that, right?
Yeah, I think there's this total misconception about the role that higher education plays and the role that student debt plays in the economy that's really just decades out of date, and nonetheless has an enormous impact on the sorts of policy proposals that are considered mainstream or acceptable in, I don't know, conventional political debate, namely that higher education is a kind of privilege of the rich, that if the graduates or master's degree students or whatever are unable to pay back their student debt, then that's because they majored in the wrong thing, and they kind of stupidly took liberal arts classes when in fact they should have majored in STEM, or they should have been indoctrinated into nonsense economics in business schools. That's just not the reality that higher education, that student debt play in the economy today. I mean, all of the routes into the labor market that would have once avoided higher education and thus student debt have been kind of shut off. And so increasingly higher education is a universal experience of entering cohorts. Even people who would have avoided it or just sort of skirted the edges of higher education in order to get a decent entry-level job now have to go through that. And at the same time, we've enormously reduced state funding to higher education institutions, and that has induced them to increase prices and tuition, so that anybody who kind of makes contact with the higher education system automatically takes on, thousands and thousands of dollars worth of student debt that would previously have not been part of the kind of economic life cycle of entering cohorts. So all of that goes to say that this idea that student debt is a privilege and that the people whining about student debt are whiny, overeducated millennials who made stupid decisions, that just has nothing to do with reality. And I think anyone who treats student debt as that sort of niche policy issue can kind of be dismissed out of hand.
Yeah, they can go take a long walk off a short pier. But also, it reminds me of the yellow vests, yellow jackets kind of protests going on in France, which is to say it's not just not an individual irresponsible choice that led to the debt. It's that society, the markets, government induces people to do this, saying that this is what will make you successful, right? Like, and credentialization, which became, as you wrote about so well, the way that basically different industries could simply require more education for any old job rather than a market that simply needs higher skilled people, and therefore the problem is that people aren't skilled enough to do the jobs. The propaganda was that if you get some more skills, if you get some more education, you're going to be able to get these great jobs, and therefore the debt you're taking on will more than pay for itself and beyond. And so people were sold a bill of goods to get into all this debt and are having a hard time paying it back because of that lie. So it's quite the opposite of somebody making an irresponsible decision. It's someone thinking they're making the responsible decision by listening to everyone else and then being doubly screwed because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that exactly encapsulates the big issue here. It's offensive to me that my fellow policy wonks and economists will take the pose of dictating to the public what they ought not to be doing, what they should be doing, taking on increased credentials, taking on more student debt in order to suit themselves to the needs of today's jobs. When the obvious failure is not the individuals taking on the debt, it's the economists who simply don't understand how the economy works, making prescriptions to individual behavior when they totally discount the role that credentialization, that employer power in labor markets plays in terms of shifting the costs of job training from employers, from institutions, from states who used to take on the role of public education to individuals at the same time as wages are stagnant or declining.
Yeah, so let's dig into this the sort of like underlying economic and normative theory. You've got a great paper which I will post in the description, but it's about the student debt crisis in general, but the sort of norm, like the slogan that unites all this stuff is something they call human capital, right? And so let me lay out my understanding of this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong and add to it. But you have the sort of like the market brain. You have neoliberal ideology, which says that individuals receive through the market what they deserve to get. And so the reason to get an education credential is because that increases your value in the market, because the more skills you have, the more money you will make. And the reason to finance higher education through loans instead of just public like institutions, just like elementary school and high school, is because the students in college will receive the benefits of those increased wages, right? And so is that a fair summary, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what is, according to your detailed and excellent research, what is wrong with that theory?
Well, where to begin? I would say the basic thing that's wrong is the idea that the market serves to pay you what you're worth, because it magically assigns the correct value to any given bundle of skills or what have you. This is sort of the essential magical assumption at the heart of free market economics, and it just doesn't hold in this case as it doesn't hold in a lot of cases. I mean, I think the labor market is the first place to look.
Yeah, but so digging into this into the human capital concept specifically, like what have you found, is it the case from your research that as people obtain and the broad population has obtained more education, they're getting paid more?
You see, Marshall, it seems like complete bullshit that people are told to get more degrees and they'll make more money, but I just don't know. Is that true? Do people get paid more when they get more education? Is that something that's actually happening?
Yeah, no. So we've seen the population's gotten a lot more educated over recent decades and recent cohorts. More and more people are going to college for a longer time, getting more degrees. People who would previously have just had a high school degree are now getting an associate's degree. People who would previously have stopped at an associate's degree are now, in more recent cohorts, going on to a BA or a master's degree, and so on and so forth. That's exactly why you see this rising student debt in the overall population. And the effect that that's having is to reduce the amount of, reduce the wages, reduce the earnings for a given education category. So I've likened this to a going up the down escalator, in the sense that, people feel the need to get more and more credentials because that's how you get more earnings than somebody who has fewer credentials. That's true. But there's sort of this rat race going on where, as everybody sort of scrambles up the escalator and the escalator is going down, down, the earnings associated with a given level of credentials is declining, and that's what's creating essentially wage stagnation in the cross section, even as people's higher education credentials and therefore their student debt is just skyrocketing upwards.
And is that related to the fact that, any good prescription has to understand that the diagnosis has to be good for the prescription to be right? So was that just a false diagnosis that the problem in the economy was the lack of skilled workers, and therefore if we get the skilled workers, that will solve things? So was it a bullshit solution because the diagnosis was wrong?
Yes. In a word, there was a misunderstanding of how the labor market works, that the rising inequality, the wage stagnation was caused by workers not having the quote-unquote skills needed for today's jobs, and therefore if they got more skills, then they would get the earnings that would be associated with higher productivity. All of that is nonsense, and it's a shame to the economics profession that they bandied this about for so many decades without having a clue what they were talking about.
This I think, we've mentioned the word credentialization in the past few minutes, but can you explain exactly that phenomenon and sort of what it reflects on, like, the behavior on the part of employers?
Yeah, so on the part of employers, what you get is the ability to shift the responsibility for job training to individual workers as a result of the increased power that employers have in labor markets. And on the part of the students/workers, that translates into needing more and more higher education degrees in order to get a given job. So I was first sort of turned on to this because a friend of mine, when I was in graduate school, had an undergraduate degree in engineering from a good engineering school that would definitely have qualified him for a good engineering job, in prior cohorts. But he had to stay for an extra year to get a master's that was another $50,000 or more in student debt in order to get that same job. And that's kind of credentialization at the high end of the labor market. If you think about, entry-level jobs that wouldn't have required higher education of any kind in the past, now requiring some training of that kind. So, the dynamic of credentialization. The thing to understand about credentialization as a dynamic in the labor market is that it's vastly unequal in its impact on different types of workers. So, being white is a credential for a lot of workers that precludes the need for increased higher education. But lots of people don't have the credential of being white, so they need to make up for that credential in other respects by taking on student debt in order to get degrees that white workers wouldn't need in order to get a given job.
Yeah. I think it's worth drawing this point out because, as you say, you have, the black and brown population. They're trying to compete. They're trying to do, do the quote unquote right thing so that they can get a good job and have a good life. And so they go to college. They get, the credential that they, the training, whatever, however they're thinking about it. But as a result of the student debt neoliberal ideology, those folks tend to get shunted into the shittiest and most exploitative institutions where they, these for-profit colleges that are springing up to fill the demand for credentials and training that the state is unwilling to provide. And so it's it's like a perfect example of how the little more subtle aspects of kind of the racism of the economic system, where you're disadvantaged at the start, and so you're pushed into this other thing that's also racist and just taking you for every penny. And even those, I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but even the credentials coming out of these for-profit colleges, people looking at it like, oh, University of Phoenix, that's a bullshit school. It's not real.
Yeah, I think any discussion of higher education and student debt and credentialization needs to take into account the degree to which the higher education system itself is highly segregated on exactly the lines that you've talked about. I mean, higher education has always been a mechanism for reproducing social hierarchy to one degree or another. I would say that we have used it. We have at times attained a more egalitarian version of higher education that opens it up to be an engine of social mobility. That's sort of what the GI Bill was about, what the California Master Plan was about in the 1960s, and those things were exactly shut down when they threatened racial hierarchy on where the student beneficiary population started to look a lot different than the tax base that was supporting it. So that's where you've gotten the sort of main political conflicts over higher education policy in the past. And I think you can see it directly in the bifurcation between for-profit and nonprofit higher ed. In some ways, I think that actually undersells the racial stratification that's going on here. So you said, you get these for-profit institutions springing up. That's certainly true. That was especially true in the Great Recession. I mean, for-profit higher education was a pretty niche sector pre-Great Recession, focused on a couple of different professional technical qualifications that's kind of suddenly expanded into its own whole part of the higher education ecosystem when there were a lot of people who were disemployed and were kind of the ideal population for such larger institutions and huge networks of private equity funded institutions to prey upon. That was kind of a enormous growth industry in the Great Recession, and I would say extending into the early 2000s. In some ways, they were already on the downswing at the end of the Obama administration. They were given regulatory relief by the Trump administration, but even so, I would say the shine is off for-profit higher education, especially these huge networks of institutions. What's scary, though, is that the nonprofits have figured out how to operate the ultra-profitable business model that the for-profits had previously pioneered. So, quote-unquote normal institutions would not have been able to expand their enrollment by tens of thousands of seats in response to an acute event like the Great Recession. Now have figured out how to append whole continuing education or professional schools to the brand name of a legacy higher education institution. I mean, that's what you get with these online degree programs where, most of the instruction is outsourced to a for-profit provider. The whole profit proposition is that the for-profit provider is kind of operating in the shadows. They'll actually do all the work in terms of programming, albeit not a very high level of instruction, but they'll say, okay, well, we'll sell you, or we'll, their pitch to the university is, give us your brand name of a fancy higher education institution. Let us give out degrees that have that name on it, and we'll do all the work. No, seriously, this is how it works.
It's a grift. It's a big grift.
Yeah. And in an environment where states have been cutting funding for public higher education institutions, it's a highly attractive one. I mean, in some ways, you can't blame the institutions for entering into contracts of that kind.
You can never blame the institutions. It's the democracy that allows these institutions to do this.
No, it's not democracy. It is the takeover of state legislatures and boards of regents by corporate interests, by right-wing funders.
The corruption. The corruption of our
I mean, the higher education sector is a parasitized husk of what it once was under the California Master Plan and its imitators in other state higher education systems, whereby it kind of the state cuts funding because the students look different from the taxpayers, and right-wing governments can say, okay, well, we cut spending and so we can do a big regressive tax cut. And in response, the administrators of the system kind of go looking for revenue wherever they can find it, and that involves whoring out their names to these, de facto for for-profit providers that just sort of license the programming, or I should say, they license their name to the for-profit providers in order to, monetize any kind of prestige that they have. So the kind of I would say the traditional for-profit systems kind of the ones that gained great notoriety in the aftermath of the Great Recession are in some ways, not the cutting edge of the grift of higher education. The cutting edge of the grift of higher education is the state university systems that you all know and love, and the kind of for-profit operators programming them on the back end through online courses and the like.
Now, Marshall, we need some good news. So tell us how a plan like Elizabeth Warren's starts to address the multifarious, corrupt, bullshit ways that higher education has been totally kind of bastardized from the public good it was meant to be.
Oh, man. So, Warren's plan has a couple of different prongs to it. We've been talking about student debt cancellation. That's the part that I particularly have, researched in the past, and I think that it's important to highlight as reflecting just the total ideological failure of this sort of human capital credentialization nonsense that you get from academic economists and the like. I mean, that tends to be my bailiwick. The Warren plan also calls for free public college. In her conceptualization of what that means, it's basically a federal-state partnership to make public higher education institutions free and equally available to all, and on a tuition-free basis. And I think that's enormously inspiring. I hope that revivifies the idea of higher education as a public good. I just, my hesitation in that is that it should, and I think, to some degree, the Warren proposal definitely does take on the degree to which the higher education business model has already been neoliberalized and needs to be rescued therefrom.
Right.
So, there's an important aspect of her proposal that is basically institutional accountability. I can tell you from experience that a big disappointment about the higher education policy scene in D.C. is that there tends to be a lot of identification with the legacy higher education institutions from people who derive an enormous amount of their self-worth from the fact that they have lots of degrees from fancy places, and so they can't see that higher education institutions would themselves be agents of exactly the same neoliberal corruption that they might easily adduce to, say, the financial industry, but they can't possibly imagine that, fancy University X would be kind of guilty of the same types of malfeasance. So I think there's elements of that in the Warren plan. That is annual audits of higher education institutions, real accountability for any institution that receives federal student loan debt. I mean, it's kind of interesting, amazingly, that the federal government is already the main funder, at least in a financial sense, of the ongoing operating budgets of the vast majority of higher education institutions in this country. But the way that we chose to do it is by lending money to individuals, and the idea is that the sort of free market of individuals as consumers choosing among higher education institutions would be sufficient to discipline the quality of the education that's being provided. This kind of market fantasy, the fantasy of the self-regulating market has failed there as it has failed everywhere else. So it's just not realistic to imagine that, individual higher education students as higher education consumers would be the mechanism by which quality is assured in the higher education space. I think one of the good aspects of the Warren plan is that it looks to leverage the enormous power that the federal government has as the financial backer of the vast majority of higher education in this country to hold institutions accountable.
So many questions. Ryan, did you want to jump in? Because I have one if you don't, but go ahead.
I guess I wanted to maybe drill down into these sort of institutional details. Freddie DeBoer, trigger warning, Freddie DeBoer, he had these a few good articles about, just like when he was at Purdue, he had some great articles about the gym and the they built some sort of a third space building that was like mostly unoccupied for a year, but just ridiculously excessive construction. It's like the nicest gym I've ever even heard of in my life. It's like 150,000 square feet or something like that. And while the English department that teaches like 5,000 students a year is like living with asbestos and broken bathrooms and stuff.
And they have to buy their own dry erase markers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you can see the logic of business and neoliberalism sort of penetrating these public institutions. And so what do you think, how do you think we like can root that out, to make it more about, to just be like, here, we're going to give you an education, it's going to be a good education, but it's going to be provided at like a decent price, and it's not going to be like living in a country club for 4 years.
Well, I just want to say that a couple of weeks ago I visited the University of Utah, where I will soon be joining the faculty, and took my own self-guided tour of the gym, which was indeed lovely, including a ski equipment rental facility. And so I will not be commenting further on the quality of gyms at elite state higher education institutions.
In fact, Marshall, we need a holistic education, and the body has to be healthy before you can have your mind right for the classroom.
Yes, indeed. And allow me to transition to that aspect of this conversation, where I hold forth on the mind-body dualism that is inherent in any higher education. No, I mean, Ryan, the points that you make about the sort of neoliberal logic of higher education are absolutely correct and on point. I think it's not out of the question to imagine that we can afford as a society to offer a free and equal, high-quality public higher education to everyone. If you look at the way that universities run nowadays, it's just it has these enormous disparities baked into it. I can't speak to what DeBoer has to say, because that guy is not my biggest fan, but I can believe that his experience at Purdue is demonstrative of what public higher education looks like. Notwithstanding, that is where the vast majority of American students are and will be educated for the foreseeable future. So I guess I would take the opportunity to say that this idea that we can sort of disrupt or dispense with the whole edifice of higher education because it's just a gigantic waste of money, and look at all these ridiculous gyms that are being built, that's not a realistic proposal in the stratified society in which we live. I think what we can do is take the institutions that we have available to us and make them radically egalitarian. And the good news with respect to higher education is that we figured out how to do it before. The problem is that we've never figured out how to do it before on a racially egalitarian basis. So I think that's really the kind of frontier on which radical higher education policy discussion and debate and agitation should proceed.
Right, and you note that actually the problem in the shifting of funding from institutions to individuals and providing for individuals to take on debt to get their own skills, in part, I mean not in part, but fundamentally had to do with race and the fact that in 1965 it wasn't feasible, or it was decided not to be feasible, right, to incorporate racially integrated higher education as part of the integration project. Or how would you describe that kind of important moment?
Yes, I think higher education is in some ways, or was in some ways, in retrospect, a bellwether of the backlash to the civil rights movement. So in the mid-'60s, we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, by which racial integration became the policy of the federal government. At the same time, through the Higher Education Act of 1965, higher education became the policy of the federal government. And yet, there was never really a moment in which racially egalitarian higher education became the policy of the federal government. And you can see that between the transition or the evolution of the Higher Education Acts. They're renewed every 7 years, I believe, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. So we got the Higher Education Act of 1965 that introduced the federal student loan system as a sort of minor aside, but also expanded institutional funding for state higher education institutions, and that was clearly inspired by the California Master Plan that had been promulgated a little bit earlier in the decade. But by 1972 and thereafter, the federal emphasis really shifted from that kind of institutional support to the student loan program, where we're investing in individuals, or individuals are taking on debt to invest in themselves and their own future earnings. And that kind of logic of individual choice and selection among institutions really, I think, undermine the whole idea of higher education as a public good, and specifically a racially egalitarian public good. So, we did adopt, at least in theory, desegregation of K-12 education as a federal policy with Brown v. Board of Education. But we never got to that same place with respect to higher education, because higher education was, even as the federal government took on that responsibility, still seen as a luxury, or at least not a necessary a component of individuals' participation as an economic person in overall society. And I think that's really what's changed. I mean, what we've seen in the enormous expansion of credentialization is that higher education is inherent component of individuals' participation as an economic person in society. And under those circumstances, we cannot continue to dole it out unequally on the basis of race.
Right. And it seems to me that this is an instance where ceding to neoliberalism is just begging for racial and gender discrimination at the hands of the market. And so it seems to me that solutions like Elizabeth Warren's, or proposals that seek to make public goods or bring public goods back from what was left to the quote unquote self-regulated market, is not just an economic but also, right, a race and gender progressive type of policy. Does that seem right to you as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And in fact, I would go farther even than Senator Warren has in this proposal, in that, where we've seen racial egalitarianism succeed in this country's history, it has been as a progressive federal policy. And I myself would support a kind of federalization of higher education in that exact same vein, if not the total federal takeover of the whole higher education system, because even I might say that should go too far as a future employee of the University of Utah. I think it would be I think it would be a benefit to the overall higher education ecosystem to have a federal higher education system that was conceived on explicitly racially egalitarian lines. So one thing I can say about my future employer that is positive is that, by the standards of flagship state higher education institutions, it is relatively racially egalitarian, in the sense that the population of the university looks racially similar to the population of the state of Utah. That is probably highly contingent on the fact that the population of the state of Utah is itself relatively racially egalitarian.
If you look at white as the snow on the slopes of Utah.
No. Well, that I think that's a little bit of poetic license, but perhaps not completely. If you look at states that do have a more diverse population, it tends to be much less represented in the population of the flagship state higher education institution. And that's where I think the federal government could really strike a blow that states by themselves will sort of never be able to attain, just sort of by the logic of the federalist system and the way in, that states tend to be less racially egalitarian in the ways that they make policy than is the federal government. When the federal government chooses to be racially egalitarian, it has succeeded at that, and states generally don't.
Ryan, I have one more. I have one more dumb question, but I'll let you go first if you want. But I want to get to my dumb question at some point.
Okay, yeah. I just happened to look up the demographics of Utah, and only 86% white. Though perhaps the determining factor is it's only 1% black. But I just wanted to the discussion about credentialization and how employers always want to have the pick of the litter, the most educated person have, the best, trained person or whatever. Do you think, Marshall, that there is too much education, at least in some respects, that people are being pushed to get degrees that are really unnecessary in certain circumstances, that there's a lot of people who could just be learning on the job and or taking shorter degrees instead of bachelor's instead of master's, or and that sort of thing.
Well, as I'm professionally interested in the provision of higher education to the broadest possible set of the population, I can't really say there's too much education. But I can definitely say that I think people are being pushed to get too many degrees or the wrong degrees or the training that should be provided on the job. That I have no problem endorsing. I think there's a very concerning tendency in the sort of public debate about higher education and the student debt crisis that says, okay, well, if people are unable to pay off their student debt, that's because they don't have the skills necessary for today's job. So the way to make sure that doesn't happen is by asking employers what skills do they need in order to be suited for the needs of today's jobs, and therefore to give employers more say over the construction of curricula and the routes to a degree that students are provided with. So if you ask sort of higher education experts, kind of like where are the innovative solutions to the student debt crisis coming from, what they'll say is, okay, well, it's programs that essentially tailor higher education more towards employers, give employers more discretion over what degrees people get, what people learn in the context of any given degree, because then employers will say, okay, well, if you churn out students that have this and this and this, then I'll hire them, and that's considered to be the cutting-edge solution to the student debt crisis, and that really worries me quite a bit because that locks in employers or students/workers to particular employers even more so than the existing system does, and that just is itself evidence of this shift of the cost of job training from employers to individuals. So I really do worry that, like, even as the kind of reality of the student debt crisis. Okay, so maybe the policy wonks have kind of realized that the student debt crisis isn't just a bunch of whiny millennials. It is in fact a kind of cohort-wide lack of earnings wherewithal to pay down the student debt that they have been instructed to take on. Well, okay, the solution to that is to kind of indenture students and workers more and more to particular employers that happen to enter into partnerships with particular higher education institutions, and that's just as your body language suggests, that is exactly the opposite of the policy solution that we need to the student debt crisis.
And they're unabashed about the indentured servitude. There are proposals for actually providing your future wages, right, to the people funding your education.
The people who do these ISAs. Kind of get very offended when you liken them to indentured servitude. They get a percentage of your wages going out a few years. You have to sign contracts that allow them to pick which bank account your wage gets paid into because they have contracts with the banks or credit unions or whatever in order to take their cut out the back end. They get to monitor what your wages in real time. I mean, like, we've been there, done that in the 18th century and every century before that.
Can I tell you, Marshall, I had this experience, and this is kind of a revelatory moment, although I'm somewhat anonymous, so it's not that risky. But I had one graduate degree. I was going for another graduate degree. And then in trying to transfer my transcripts from one school to the one I was accepted into, it turns out there was one loan that was granted by the former institution I went to that I didn't know about, that I hadn't been paying, that I just found out about. And they wanted me to pay all 10,000 of it before they would transfer the transcript. Of course, I, not having the ability to do that, couldn't do it. And so I was like, can we make a payment agreement? They need to know whether I'm accepting, and they need the transcript. And the president of the other institution got me on the phone and just tried to manhandle me to try. He must have thought that I had magic ability to pay this whole 10,000. I didn't, but like I was like, I think this is, I will be able to pay you better once I have this other degree. And he's like, well, I'm not sure. And he said, technically you're, in debt to me, and I should have a say what your future should look like and whether this is a good investment for you.
Did he write that down?
I should have made him do it, but he was really telling me that I'm the one that gets to decide about your future, right? And I don't know that this is a good investment for you.
That's astounding. I know a couple of lawyers that you should definitely talk to. That is illegal under the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The idea that a president of a higher education institution would tell you what job you are and are not allowed to take, or what degree you can or cannot enroll for, is the total derogation of every principle on which this country was founded. And the idea that that would in any way be acceptable under the existing economic paradigm should cause my entire profession to go hang their heads in shame, never to be seen in public again until they issue a blanket apology to the entire United States population signed by every single PhD economist who has currently been adjudicated as such by any PhD granting institution in this country.
You're my new best friend, Marshall. I appreciate that. Happy ending to the story. I went and found like a hedge fund manager.
Oh, congratulations. That's the solution to every policy problem.
No, but who was going to give me a personal loan to be able to do this. But then at the last minute, literally the day that my transcripts were due, the institution called and it was all a bullshit bluff, and they sent the transcript. They wanted to wait until the last day.
So neoliberalism does work. I'm glad to hear this happy ending that shows that the market is in fact all powerful
so
and knows everything.
It was so traumatic. I can't even tell. I mean, you can imagine. But that leads me into my next set of questions, if you don't mind. Just a few questions. I'm really hoping that proposals like Elizabeth Warren can do what we hope to combat this neoliberal nightmare. But I had two countervailing thoughts this morning as I read about the news, and Ryan's like, "You're dumb, but ask Marshall," and so that's what I'm doing. And so my first thought was, shit, because I teach at a small college, private college. I'm like, shit, this college is going under. Right? Like it's already like financially a little shaky, and I'm like, this is done. It's done. There's, that was my first thought. Then my second thought was, wait a minute. It would take a while to expand the number of public colleges available. So doesn't that just mean that the current public colleges will be really, really competitive because everyone wants a free education? And so all the people who are like 50-50 on private versus public are going to go for the public ones, making their acceptance rates really, really like low, or, just really selective. And doesn't that mean that my poor students who are already working a number of hours just to pay their tuition at my college are going to be the ones that get fucked? And everyone else that like can pay for tutors to get them into these free public colleges are going to benefit, and then my poor students. So I went from thinking about myself to fearing for my students. So alleviate my concerns here.
Wow. Well, I mean, what you just described kind of implicates the whole industrial organization of the higher education system, I think, in ways that we don't quite understand fully. So it's a little bit hard for me to make a total prediction. I think there's no reason to believe that in the status quo things will depart in any meaningful way from the way that they are currently being conducted, which means that, overall, notwithstanding the gigantic scam that higher education and student debt represent, the shift of the cost of job training from employers to individuals, basically people have no other choice, so they will continue to enroll in higher education, both public and private, and take on the debt necessary because they basically have no other route to making a living. And it's a little there, as we were talking about earlier with respect to the kind of obsolescence of the traditional for-profit business model, but the sense in which nonprofit institutions have figured out how to operate themselves like for-profits, that's going to kind of ripple through the higher education system for a couple of years or decades to come, barring any significant policy change. But I don't really foresee that kind of like one segment of the nonprofit higher education system will definitively triumph over another, other than what we've already seen, which is the legacy wealthiest institutions just sort of continue to kind of accelerate beyond anybody else, and everybody else kind of fighting for scraps.
Right, and I saw that Elizabeth Warren said there's $100 billion in her plan for Pell Grants. Maybe that has to do with the private college part of it.
Yes, I mean, I think that speaks to the issues that low-income students have, kind of paying for college beyond just the tuition issue. So I think that's kind of crucially important to ensure that a free college plan does in fact make it possible for people of all income levels and backgrounds to have access to this kind of newly universalized public good. And I think, there's a lot of debate in the higher education policy world about whether expanding federal aid increases tuition on its own account. And I think the best evidence shows that Pell Grants don't, but increased loan amounts do. So in that respect, I think that the way that the Warren proposal is pitched is designed to kind of reel in the upward inflationary pressure on tuition that has been kind of baked into the expansion of the federal student loan program to date.
Cool. Well, I know you got to head out, Marshall, but thanks for coming on.
Yep.
And we'll keep our fingers crossed that
Yeah, this has
something
been wonderful.
like this
Thank
will
you.
pass soon.
Yeah,
Thank
good.
you so much for putting my mind at ease, my friend.
If I did that, then I definitely did not accomplish my mission. Great talking to you guys. Glad we could do this. Good to be talking about the hell that awaits us all, no matter what our relationship to the higher education world. Glad we could connect on this.
That's right. You're always welcome back to talk about the hell that we are persisting through together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Have a good evening, guys.
You too.
Bye.
Take care.
Yep, bye.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.